I think I may just begin. Okay, Charity?
Okay.
Yeah. So good evening. I'm Kathy Kennedy. I'm the Senior Outreach Manager for the Peconic Land Trust, and I'm welcoming you to our series of panel-style Zoom conversations. It has been very interesting to recreate a lot of the programming that we do in person as virtual programs this year, and we're going to be continuing that for a while. I hope you've been enjoying them so far. We've covered a lot of topics over the past year, including conversations like this featuring local farmers, chefs, producers of specialty items, as well as we program on the importance of native plants. We did a program on being tick smart on Long Island, as well as the future of horticulture, and even a talk with some local artists as part of the Plein Air Peconic group, and their connection to art in their work, their connection to conservation in their work. Tonight, we're excited to introduce you to three people that are sharing an expertise in marine farming, and that is working our bays and wetlands to deliver fresh seafood to your table. Each of these marine farmers have seen changes to the waters off Long Island, and I hope you find this conversation to be interesting, informative, and thought-provoking, actually. Thank you for tuning in. And again, special thanks to our three panelists and our moderator. I hope that you're all doing well and staying safe and healthy. From all of us at the Trust, of course, we wish you the best. And we are grateful that you spent some time tonight with us and tuning into the conversation. On a housekeeping note, you're all muted during the conversation, but at the end, we will be answering questions. So you can enter those questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end. A little bit about the Peconic Land Trust. As you know, the Peconic Land Trust was founded in 1983, and we're committed to conserving working farms and natural lands and our heritage. And with your help, as well as with the support of really thousands of individuals, partner organizations, foundations, community groups, and all levels of government, we've been able to accomplish a lot. We've protected over 13,000 acres of land, including thousands of acres of natural lands, wetlands, shorelands, meadows, and woodlands that provide places to explore nature, offer habitat for wildlife, and protect water for drinking, fishing, aquaculture, and recreation. In addition, with your support, we've helped conserve over 6,000 acres of farmland that is available to farmers growing food and many other agricultural products. Working farms are an important part of our mission. And we know that protection of the farmland is really the first step in the continuum that goes beyond the beautiful landscapes and vistas. Protecting the land and then of course helping the farmers be as productive and successful as possible remains a high priority for us. We've supported efforts to provide local food to communities and affordable access to land, administering our grants and programs that help the farmers grow and offer educational programs to help them maintain their high standards. All of this and more we're able to accomplish because of your support. Thank you. For today's panel, we're so pleased to have Ben Gonzalez of Southold Bay Oysters, who operates his business from the Trust Shellfisher Preserve in Southold, Paul McCormick of Great Gun Oyster Farm in Moriches Bay, and Steve Tettelbach, who was a shellfish ecologist and professor emeritus at Long Island University. Our moderator for tonight's program is journalist Charity Robey. Charity writes for the Shelter Island Reporter, Suffolk Times, Newsday, and the New York Times. Her 2019 New York Times piece about the die-off of Peconic Bay scallops helped bring attention to the links between the health of wild shellfish on Long Island and human-induced climate change. A food historian, her paper on scallop flavor and history was published by the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery in 2018. And her paper on the regulation of Long Island commercial fishing was published in 2020. Pretty amazing work that Charity has been doing. Before I turn the program over to Charity and our panelists, a final reminder on the Q&A. Please use the button at the bottom of the screen to pose a question to the panelists. At the end of the program, we'll be turning to those questions to try to answer them and get some more information out to you. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Charity. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. That was great. Appreciate it. Well, so we're here to talk about aquaculture, but I want to start by just pointing out that aquaculture is not a modern invention. I think sometimes it feels like, it is, that it was something that was created recently, but Native Americans practiced aquaculture long before European people came to this continent. But since the main type of aquaculture that's still practiced in New York is oyster cultivation, and since we'll still be talking mainly about oyster farming, I'll start us out with 5 minutes of historical context on Long Island oyster cultivation to put some of the rest of what we're going to talk about in context. And then I'll ask Ben and Paul and Steve to take it from there. So oyster aquaculture on Long Island goes back to the early 1800s. And that's because that is the period of time when overfishing exhausted the natural oyster beds, the wild oyster beds, especially in Great South Bay, but also elsewhere. And so by the early 20th century, in most years, over 90% of the oysters taken from New York waters, even then, were farmed oysters. That's in the early 20th century. So it's been going on. Oyster farming has been going on a long time on Long Island. The oyster production in the Great South Bay peaked between 1900 and 1910. And at that time, oyster growers could lease underwater property from the state of New York, provided that there were no natural oyster beds in the area. They could lease the land or the underwater land and raise oysters there. I want to show you a picture of the Warren. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a beautiful picture of a very early oyster cultivation technique. This is actually from a European. I think these were French oysters that were being grown. But this is just to give you some context for how old oyster cultivation is. This is from a book that was published in 1891. So they were growing spat on twigs at that time. Then later in the 30s, by the 30s on Long Island, there were different types of oyster cultivation in place, and I'll let we're not going to go into how that was modernized, but suffice it to say that it worked, because by 1900, 1910, there were a ton of oysters coming out of the New York waters, and these are photographs, and they're that are representative of some of the oyster activity. I think the guy in the lower left is working with wild oysters because they're growing together in reefs. But the one on the lower right, I think those are farmed more likely. But oystering was a huge business in those days. And the 1938 hurricane caused a lot of damage to the Long Island wild oyster beds, but they were still quite productive. In 1950, there were 1.2 million bushels of oysters harvested in New York. Do you have oh yeah, this is a pamphlet. I had to show you this because I think this is it's so interesting. One of the ways you can sort of document the popularity or the ubiquitous nature of oysters is by looking at the products that were made from it. In 1930, this pamphlet was produced advertising a substance called Warren's Oyster Puree, which was basically oysters mashed together and sold in 8-ounce containers. And these are recipes for using the oyster puree. You could make soufflés out of it. You could make fritters out of it. You could use it as almost like ketchup. I guess it was sort of an American version of oyster sauce. But oysters were used in all kinds of food. It was not just people eating oysters on the half shell. They were eaten in pan roasts, menus from the time, for big events would have 4 or 5 different kinds of oysters. So there were a lot of oysters around. They were relatively inexpensive, and they were used widely. By 2012, 1950, it was 1.2 million bushels. By 2012, we were getting about 34,000 bushels of oysters out of Long Island waters. So obviously, huge decrease in production. All farmed, pretty much, almost 100% farmed. And the 2017 oyster harvest, most recently, was also still quite, down around 34,000. That's actually up. It got worse, and now it's back up to about 34,000. The most recent data, 2017, that I could find, and that's about $2.78 million. So today there are very few natural oyster reefs in New York waters. They're mostly on the North Shore, and 90 to 100% of the oyster landings are from aquaculture. So with that history and context for our discussion, the 3 people who are up to their elbows in the present and the future of Long Island aquaculture are Ben and Paul and Steve. And Ben, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you. If you would tell us a little bit about the place where you raise shellfish, your shellfish. Has it changed since you've been farming there? And tell us a little bit about how your farm works.
Yep, thank you, Charity. First of all, we don't make oyster puree anymore, even though it sounds delicious. No. So I grow my oysters in the middle of Southold Bay. I lease 10 acres of underwater land just between Shelter Island and the North Fork. When you guys go into Southold Bay, we are right there, excellent. Our farm is a deep water farm. I will say that every single oyster farm is completely different than any other farm. So the way we grow our oysters, if you can actually show the picture, we do buy our oysters as oyster seed, which is like very, very small baby oysters. When we talk about people about oyster farming, they all think that we go out fishing and bring our oysters out from the deep waters, and that is not the case. If you are eating an oyster in New York, there's a very high chance that that oyster was farmed in New York. So if you look at the upper left photo, that's about the size of the oysters that we get. To tend them in the farm, we put them inside grow-out cages, and the grow-out cages look like something what you have in the middle. That cage that you see on that photo is the first cage we ever put in the water. And we were so excited. We put it down there. As you can see, it's extremely clean. It's just perfect conditions. Once the oysters are in the water, they really grow by the amount of food they actually go through the water. Oysters don't swim. They don't move. So they grow based on a filter in the water where they live. So based on the flow of water that comes to them and the algae that's in there, that's actually how they will grow. They will take the flavor profile based on those waters. So when you eat my oysters, as Southold Chindigs, you are testing the flavor profile of the bottom of Southold Bay, which is 20 feet deep in the area where we are. And as you can see, just 4 weeks later, you can see the cage on the right is when the oysters are getting much of a bigger size. That cage, once the oysters start growing, easily will weigh about 1,000 pounds. So once we're working in the middle of the bay, it's usually one hand on the boat, one hand on the cage. Be careful what you're doing. And as you can see in the bottom, oysters start growing on a very healthy rate. Oysters will start, matching into each other, which is what you saw in some of the pictures, Charity. The way of protecting themselves from the environment and the element is actually building shells. And they will bring the shells for themselves, or they will use their partner shells and bring an oyster reef. That will not look very good on plates. People now like to eat oysters on the half shell. To avoid oysters growing into each other, at the farm, every 4 weeks, we bring the oysters to land, and we actually run them to the tumbler, which is the photo you see in the bottom. The tumble just makes the oysters spin around, and they separate from each other. The tumble also breaks the edge of the oysters. And instead of the oysters growing flat, they get actually grow in a deeper cup. So you have more of a space for them to actually have their meat. This process will take about 20 months. Depends on the temperature of the water and how much algae is there for them to grow. So from the moment we get a seed in the first photo that you see until you actually can have an oyster that is over 3 inches to serve in the market is about 20 months. So it's a long process. We spend a lot of the time in middle of Southold Bay. Any of you guys that are boaters or are swimmers, you might see us moving the cages around. We know that because people come to the farm and they take selfies with us when we're in the water. Even though the cages are hanging, you know, you say people come and take selfies. So we like to see you guys around.
Great. That's great. So, Paul, your farm is a different setup, right? Could you tell us a little bit about about how you do what you do?
Yeah, it was a good pairing to have Ben and I on for the sake of really showing a contrast in the way oysters can be grown and are grown on Long Island. So unlike Ben's site, and I believe, Ben, you're probably in about 20 to 30 feet of water.
About, yeah.
Yeah. My farm is a shallow water site located in Moriches Bay on the north side of Moriches Bay. So it's right up against the mainland. It's only about 135 feet off the beach and extends to about 535 feet. It's a 4-acre farm. The water depth ranges from, it can get down to 4 or 5 inches on a very, very low tide in the wintertime. But the average depths are about 18 inches to 4 feet. So you can see one of my workers there standing on the farm. And again, unlike Ben's farm, Ben uses off-bottom cages. They're situated on the bottom. Our farm is a floating farm. We use much lighter weight equipment. We use same principle as the cages. They're mesh bags. If you look in the lower right corner, you can see those are our trawl lines. They're about 115 feet long. And those are the mesh bags with floating pontoons on each side. They keep the oysters up at the surface of the bay, and that's where most of the food is concentrated. As you can see, we don't have, we use boats. You don't see any here, but obviously we have to tend the farm with boats and, you know, do our processing and harvesting. And but we have a lot of, because one of the virtues of a floating farm is we have a lot of the elements, natural elements do the work for us. So you can see those floating cages, the upside of those cages are exposed to the sun and the wind. And that helps to control biofouling. The sun and the wind basically burns off any of the algae that grows on the undersides of the bags. And then we flip the bags over every 7 days. And then the other side of the bags get cleaned, and that mesh bag stays clean. The mesh stays open and allows for maximum water flow to flow through, and then the oysters can maximize the amount of food that they get. Our process is similar to Ben's in terms of, you can see that picture of the seed in the middle of the arrangement here. It looks like we probably buy our seed at about the same size, I would say 20 millimeters, something like that. And in April, we stock the bags at about 1,000 oysters. They grow, just like Ben described. A few months later, we have to split the seed because they're taking up the full volume of the bag, and we don't want them to have outcompete each other for food. So we'll split down to 500 seed into other bags that are placed out. And then they're growing very, very rapidly on the surface of the farm. By September 1st, we effect our last split. We get down to 250 seed per bag. And we're actually starting to bring oysters to market in September from the oysters that we planted in April. So it's an extremely fast growth rate. And we're very fortunate to have, again, to receive the benefits of a floating farm.
That's great.
Charity, that tells you the difference between locations. I mean, my farm, since it is a deep water farm, the bottom of the bay is a little bit colder. So the oyster growth is a little bit slower. The same oyster is the same species, me and Paul are growing. Mine will take about 20 months to get to market size.
Right. And Ben, your farm is in the middle of Peconic Bay, so you're located right sort of between Shelter Island and Southold. Is that
Correct. I'm actually in the middle of Southold Bay, which is
Southold Bay?
Shelter
I'm
Island
sorry,
and
yeah.
the town of Southold.
And Paul, you are in Moriches.
Yep, I'm in Moriches Bay. It's a fairly shallow estuary. It's just to the east of Great South Bay and just to the west of Shinnecock Bay.
All right. So Steve, tell us a little bit about what you do in Orient.
Sure. So the work that I do is involved with bay scallops, and I'm not a farmer, but the work that I do depends directly and very heavily on the farming of scallops. And I work at the Cornell Cooperative Extension Hatchery in Southold. This is where they grow actually oysters, hard clams, and bay scallops. And typically they start growing oysters first, then hard clams, and then scallops. Scallops are by far the most temperamental species of those three. And the steps to grow them are more involved because they have a very different lifestyle than oysters do. Scallops like to move around. Once oysters settle to the bottom, they stay in place. But scallops, and so they need more room when they're being grown. The pictures you see here are of the part of the hatchery at the lab. The upper right is some of the algal culture that's done there. We grow the food for the shellfish. And basically what we do there is we grow them from, we actually spawn the adults and then grow them all the way up to the stages where they'll get planted out in the field. So at the hatchery in Southold, we grow them up to about 2 millimeters in size. They get transferred into nets, sort of like you see here, at another location nearby in Southold at Goose Creek. This has tremendous water flow and very, very high food levels. It's actually very close to where Ben is located. And they grow very rapidly there. And within about 3 weeks, they grow to a size of about 10 millimeters. Then they get transferred out to our main grow out area, which is up in Orient Harbor. Differently than what Ben and Paul do, we don't grow them to sell. What we're doing is we're growing scallops to become parents of future generations. So basically what we're doing is restoration work by using aquaculture to grow scallops and then have them serve as the broodstock for future generations. We started doing work on scallops back in the mid 80s when the brown tides wiped out the scallop stocks. And then the round that we're working on now is been going on now that we're going into our 17th year. But what you see here is a picture of what this facility looks like, our big spawner sanctuary in Orient Harbor. And at this stage, the scallops get stocked into these lantern nets at sizes between 30 to 50 plus millimeters, and only 35 animals per tier. And that's because they need room to move around a little bit. But the basic idea is they go out in the summer, they overwinter in these nets, and then these scallops spawn themselves at the age of about a year old in late spring or early summer of the following year after they were born. And then they are producing literally billions and even into the trillions of larvae that will settle into different parts of the bay. And that's how we are addressing trying to increase the populations of scallops. This is an aerial shot of the early days of our longline fields. The dots there are actually buoys that are about 1.5 feet in diameter, and we're located the Orient Causeway up in a corner of Orient Harbor.
So Steve, in the years that you've been raising scallops, and that's in that area, have you seen changes in the underwater in the area?
Yeah, so we've actually seen changes in a couple of places. One is that at the hatchery itself, we were drawing water from Cedar Creek, which is very shallow, heats up in the summer, and we were having actually problems with water quality. So a few years ago, we actually were able to get permission to put in a line to draw seawater directly from the deeper part of the bay. And that has helped tremendously in terms of what we've done there. So that's been one of the changes at the lab. We expanded the facility there to accommodate the increased, actually it was for growing algae. We had more animals we were dealing with, so we had to grow more food. But in terms of Orient Harbor, I would say there's not too much change at the site itself in terms of the physical nature of it, but we've been dealing with changes in water quality and types of algae that are present there. And I know that's something that we'll get into a little bit later, you know. But one thing that has changed is, you know, Ben and Paul can speak to this, but one of the real bane, the bane of aquaculture for marine aquaculture is fouling organisms. And we get incredible levels of organisms that settle as larvae onto our nets. So things like sea squirts and small crabs and barnacles and algae and you name it. So that means you have to stay on top of that and make sure that the water flow is still good for growing the shellfish.
Paul, what about you? What have you seen?
Steve was saying.
Yeah, well,
I'm sorry, Ben. Yeah.
one of the most striking observations is, you know, the farm provides physical habitat, much like an oyster reef. And so when I first applied for my lease, my lease site was just barren, which is one of the reasons why we located it there. There was no sensitive subaquatic vegetation or other species. It was literally like just a white sandy desert in the shallow water. Once we situated the farm, we got a lot of visitors quickly in all shapes and sizes. And now we open a bag of oysters and we dump them on the harvesting table. It's just full of all types of life, from all variety of invertebrates, crustaceans, crabs, finfish, other shellfish. It's like the farm has become a living, breathing reef. And so there's you know, literally hundreds of species of marine life that have been attracted and call the farm home. On the water quality front, that's kind of difficult to assess. You know, when you're situated in a large bay, to make any kind of a judgment about if you can observe water quality improvement and if that can be attributed to the farm. But what I can say is that what I mentioned before, when we first selected the farm, one of the requirements to situate an oyster farm or any shellfish farm is that there can't be any sensitive subaquatic vegetation. What I mean by that generally is eelgrass, which is a keystone species for the ecosystem. And so again, it was sort of a barren area. And after 6 years of farming, we're starting to see eelgrass come back just beyond the perimeter of the farm. And that was an area that we had to scope out as well. 25 feet beyond the farm, there wasn't allowed to be any subaquatic vegetation. But now we're starting to see that come back. And that's most likely, I mean, Steve could probably speak to this more accurately than I can, but my hunch is that they're coming back because there's an improvement in water clarity, which allows more sunlight penetration and allows this eelgrass to flourish. So that's a good indication that possibly our farms are, even at this small scale right now, the industry is still in its infancy, is having a positive impact on water quality.
Ben, what have you seen? Any changes? Let's see. You've been farming there for six years now, right?
For 6 years now, and I have to say that oyster farming is extremely good for the environment. People think about farming and they actually think about a negative connotation to it. But in this case, we actually are putting a baby oyster into the water. We're keeping it there, and we're taking an adult oyster out of the water. There's nothing to be added. It's Mother Nature do it. It's magic. And one oyster oysters are filter feeders. So one oyster will actually filter about 50 gallons of water in one day, as they actually get the nutrients and the energy from the water. As they filter the water, what they do is they take nitrogen out of the water, and then the entire water column gets clean. So other animals actually in the ecosystem enjoy the better quality of the water that is surrounding the oyster farms. If you take into account the oyster farms that are around Long Island, we estimate that every day, all of the oysters that are in the water in the farms are filtering about 1 billion gallons of water. That is a lot of water that's actually being filtered in the waters of Long Island because of the oyster farming. So our cages in the bottom, as Paul was saying, become a little bit of an artificial reef, an artificial reef ecosystem. When we pull the cages out, we have to let the cages hang out of the boat because we just start seeing all of the visitors that start actually running away from the cage. We see crabbers running out, fish trying to get out. Some of them don't make it out, so they actually end up in the bottom of our boat. So at the end of the workday, we actually go out and we scoop everyone out and put them back into the water. And I'm sure they're swimming back into the cages again.
So, I forgot to ask you to talk a little bit about the support and sort of the infrastructure of the Shellfishers Preserve to your farm. Can you touch on that a little bit? Because you were saying a minute ago about how sort of holistic the farm is, that you put something in, the seed, you don't put anything else in. But it's also interesting to me, at least, that the seed that you're putting in was raised right there. And
our oysters are born and raised in the facility where we work. So our land operation is based at the Shellfisher Preserve in Southold, which is owned and managed by the Peconic Land Trust. It is a preserve area. It's about 14 acres of land operations and water surroundings that were originally an oyster farm back in the 1930s. Now we are so proud that we're actually keeping the momentum going and still operating an oyster farm. There's a hatchery in place that I would say that if you are eating an oyster that is growing in the eastern end of Long Island, there's a very good chance that it was born in that hatchery. It's actually the second biggest hatchery in the island. So we actually grow them in the operation until they're about 2 inches on size. And once they're ready to be moved to the grounds, then we move them to the middle of Southold Bay. So you get, when we do farm tours, hopefully this summer, if conditions are better, you get to see the process from the moment the oysters are born all the way up to the life cycle and enjoying them at the beach.
Great. I guess this is a question for Steve, but maybe, you know what? Let's talk first about some more of the sort of practicalities. Ben, could you talk a little bit about what is involved in getting into oyster farming, just in terms of, prior to getting into this, you were a marketing executive at Verizon, 25 years, in business, and you decided to get into a new business. Can you give a sense of what's involved in that? Is it like buying a farm and buying tractors, and is it that kind of investment, or?
It is not. The first thing you have to do is make sure your family is okay, that you are not going crazy, that you are going to an oyster farm. Everybody was calling me, making sure, are you sure about this? So yeah, I didn't know anything about oyster farming. So what I did is I learned the SPAT program that is run by the Cornell Cooperative Extension in Southold. And the program main focus is actually restoration and education. So once you join the program, you participate in monthly lectures that they teach you, and the whole process of growing oysters from the moment actually they are spawned all the way to the end until you are ready to grow up. Well, one of the good elements is that they will give you 1,000 baby oysters that you have to tender to this process. So you just join the program, you get 1,000 babies. It's your responsibility to either kill them or grow them. I was lucky enough that most of mine actually grew, and you are able to use the facilities on their farm. So we learn everything about oyster farming through the fantastic program at the SPAD. In that program, you are not allowed to sell your oysters. These oysters are for water quality purposes and also for your own enjoyment. So we were very popular. We were going to every house party bringing oysters, and that's how our oysters are called Southold shindigs. So every time we show up, there's a shindig. After doing that for a few years, we applied for a lease to get our own underwater land in the middle of Southold Bay. And we applied to a program that is managed by the Suffolk County, which is the a program that leases underwater land in the Peconic bays. It's a fantastic program because it actually has organized the bays on areas that are actually prompt for oyster farming and areas that are protected that actually should not be used for oyster farming. And every year they will actually grant 10 farmers 10 acres of underwater land that you are actually responsible for maintaining into your operations going forward. And then for the land element, we joined the aquaculture cooperative in the Shellfisher Preserve. We had to buy an oyster boat. After we actually got our site for the grow out of the oysters, we realized the shallow area is 20 feet deep. The deep area is about 60 feet deep. So of course we had to put a crane on the boat. And then the crane is actually one of the most expensive things we had to put on. The crane can actually lift almost 1,000 pounds with no problem.
So you got the 10 acres, but not the mule.
Correct. I didn't read the fine print. So it was a long process. Then the permits to actually get the farm going will take easily a year to a year and a half. You get permits from the DEC, the Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers. So it is actually a process that is vetted throughout the application process. At the same time, there are public hearings. So anyone who's actually surrounding and your neighbors have a chance to provide comments on that. We have been in operations now for 5 years. And I have to say that, I mean, we love the location in Southold Bay. We get to spend the whole day working in the waters, and we love that area there.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So Steve, I want to touch on some of the, sort of the threats to shellfish. Although I have to say, from your description, if I had to choose between being a scallop and being an oyster, I would definitely want to be a scallop. I mean, they get to swim and they get those great looking green milkshakes you make for them. Really, that algae looks delicious.
It does.
But I know that there are threats to all shellfish. I mean, let's face it, there are there are a lot fewer of them than there were 100 years ago. And in the case of scallops, they've been extremely under pressure. So what are the natural threats to farmed shellfish? And if you would also talk a little bit about what some of the man-made threats are to these.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so, the basic idea behind aquaculture is you're trying to grow animals for food, but in so doing, what you're doing is you're increasing the survival rates compared to what happens in nature, or growth rates also as well. And in nature, it may only be 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 animals that's born that makes it to maturity. It's probably well less than that. So aquaculture, you're stacking the deck. You're making things easier for the shellfish to survive and grow. And obviously, that has to be done in order for a business to work. But so the natural threats include predation. Predation is probably the main source of mortality in the natural environment. And in aquaculture, it depends on the type of method you use. But if you're growing them in cages, you're trying to get around the risk of predation. But some of the plantings of scallops that we do, in addition to holding them in nets, is we plant them directly to the bottom. And that's a very risky proposition if it's done when they're very small. So predation is really probably the main natural threat to shellfish survival. But in addition to that, disease and parasites can be an issue. Oyster farming for many decades has had to deal with a couple of major diseases that now have kind of been worked around to some degree because of selective breeding. So trying to develop resistance to these oyster diseases. In addition to that, just the fouling organisms that we talked about, you know, they don't necessarily kill the shellfish themselves directly, but they can affect their growth rates and ultimately their survival. One of the fouling organisms that can get into oysters, although what the growth rates that Paul and Ben get, you probably don't see this as much of an issue, but it's a sponge that bores into the shell of the oyster and can weaken the shell. So that's an issue for oysters that are out for years. But I don't know, Ben, do you have much problem with the boring sponges for where you grow the oysters?
No, I mean, since my farm is actually at the bottom of the bay, there's not much of growth on those elements that happen in there. And also, this strength of the shell is very important.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
as we tumble the oysters, while they actually go through the tumbler, they get cleaned, but also the shells get a little bit broken on the sides. And the oyster's nature is actually to heal itself. So they will actually start growing shell again and get stronger. So what we do, we tumble the entire farm every 4 weeks. And there's a good chance that oysters you're eating might have been tumbled 2 or 3 times in the summer. And that makes it for a very, very strong shell. And then, of course, when you chuck it, you'll see that the shell will not break. When you put the knife in, it just open it up.
Yeah. So in addition to that, I mean, weather is a major factor here. You know, whether it's ice in the winter, although that hasn't been too prominent in the last couple of years, but you know, storms, you know, can wreak havoc with any type of aquaculture facility.
I was shocked to see what an effect the 38 hurricane had on the oyster population. It destroyed it.
Yeah, the hurricane had a major effect. You know, going back in the history of baseballs in the 1930s, there was a disease that affected the eelgrass populations along the U.S. Atlantic coast and also in Europe. And because bay scallops in the natural environment are so heavily dependent upon eelgrass, that decimated the bay scallop populations in the 1930s. And for many states, they never recovered as a result of that. In terms of man-made threats to shellfish crops, you know, there's economic ups and downs, and you know, the price that you can get in the market, and there's a number of factors that can affect that. But theft is actually a big issue in some aquaculture operations. So we haven't had much issue with that, fortunately, with our scallop plantings and so forth. But I have to say that the most prominent threat, certainly going forward, is climate change. We're seeing now in the last 2 years a huge die-off of adult bay scallops in the Peconic bays, and we believe that is being driven by climate change. So bay scallops are very temperamental. They're growing at the southern end of their range for the type of bay scallops we work with. So as the water's warm, they're being stressed even more, and in combination with a disease that was discovered a year and a half ago in bay scallops, you know, which is also being exacerbated by climate change. You know, that really is, to me, going forward, the major threat to shellfish.
Right. There's also, I mean, as more and more lease spaces are taken, I hear about conflict with people on land as well. I don't know, you know, to what extent this has had an effect already on aquaculture, but I think it's potentially, or do you think it's potentially a problem going forward? And I guess it's affecting more oysters. So maybe this is a question for Paul and Ben.
Yeah, maybe I could just say a couple of things in general. You know, what it comes down to is there's different competing uses for water, whether it's fresh waters or salt waters. And, you know, in other parts of the world, aquaculture is very high up on the ladder in terms of its importance in a bay. I mean, if you look at pictures from Japan, for example, they'll have, almost the entire bay is filled with floats where they're suspending their cages of shellfish from there. And so the thought of running a sailboat around there is just, it's impossible. So, it's these competing uses for water. And in the United States, recreation definitely takes precedence over aquaculture in almost every body of water that I can think of. And there are many other potential uses for water as well. So, these can lead to conflicts, and that that's one of the things that can make it difficult for aquaculture. Now, the permitting process that Ben described is one that you're supposed to be working in areas that are not prime shellfish harvesting areas, and are not supposed to be in conflict with most other things. But there are certainly some issues that have arisen, and I know that Paul and Ben can speak to that about that more.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought the question, because water quality is actually one of the elements that the oyster farming actually really intersects with. As I mentioned, all of the oyster farms that we have in Long Island, they are filtering easily 1 billion gallons of water every day. But if you look at the evolution of oyster farming in the last years, right now, we actually have almost like 46% less water being used for aquaculture than actually in the 50s and 60s. So almost half of the water is actually not used for aquaculture anymore. And if you look at the Peconic bays, the greater Peconic bays, through the lease program, right now, only half of 1% of the water is being used for aquaculture. So even though you will see that there's a lot of oysters in the market, and there's a good interest for oysters, you hardly see the farms. When you go out to Southold Bay, you don't even know where the farms are. And there is concern that has been expressed by a few folks in Jack clubs and other organizations that oyster farmers might be taking over the bay. It's not real. It's impossible for oyster farmers to take over the bay. As I said, it's less than 0.5% right now that is being used. And I think that the waters are we share, and we all have a role to play on that piece. And that's one of the elements that the Suffolk County lease program put in place. It's a process on which everybody gets to express their opinion, and also being able to validate that the farms are placed in the right locations. That program is going through a review process right now. So I would encourage folks to reach out to your legislators and express your support to the program. The first weeks of February, they will be voting in Suffolk County the renewal of the program. So I think that it is crucial. If we all love water quality and we enjoy eating oysters, this is a moment in which a community has to come together.
Paula, I think in your area, you're actually involved in some of the leases. You've been assisting the town of Brookhaven.
Yeah.
Are these issues in Moriches as well?
Not actively. So hopefully we've had some foresight in crafting a code which hopefully takes in all stakeholder concerns, relevant stakeholder concerns. So we've written code to make sure that farms are not situated adjacent to private property owners. It doesn't interfere with their viewscape. We try to institute good neighbor policy. We do a lot of outreach to the public to explain to them, just like we're doing here tonight, about all the virtues and benefits of oyster farming, so that they can understand just how important it is, for our estuaries, for the health of our environment, also to continue our cherished marine heritage on Long Island. But there is potential, as Ben spoke. There's really a number of concerning conflicts out in the Peconics, and we have our eye on that as well. And we have to watch closely what goes on. So, what affects farmers in one place could easily start to expand and affect farmers in other places. So we feel confident that we have a good code in place. We have leadership that we're very fortunate to have right now that really understands these virtues about oyster farming, and they've done quite a bit of public outreach to educate the community and extol the virtues of what we're doing. But anything can happen, and you just have to be active about that.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've heard expressed is the concern that even if individual situations can be worked out, that overall there's a chilling effect on the growth of aquaculture. And I know in addition to raising oysters, you're also having success with kelp, growing that in shallow water. I hope you'll talk about that a little bit. But I think it's important in that context to have some dialogue around this issue of the viewscape. Personally, now that I know that you can grow oysters in 4 feet of water, I'm ready to put some bags down there in Chase Creek. I'd like to see them. But I get that not everybody looks at it
To
that
me,
way.
an oyster farm is aesthetically pleasing generally, unless it's completely disorganized. Most folks, tend to have well-organized farms, and they're visually appealing. But like you say, everybody is different. As long as everybody is agreeing on reality and the facts of what's going on, we can shape policy that way. But there's a lot of misinformation as well that we kind of have to deal with. So, and the kelp. I don't know when
tell us a little bit about kelp. No, this is really interesting.
I think I sent the picture. Did I'm gonna put that up.
It's in your slides. Yeah.
Give me a second. I'll share it.
Okay. So, we were very fortunate. Me and my farm was very fortunate to be contacted by Stony Brook with a pilot program that they were working with Green Wave, which is really a sort of a pioneer. In the upper right corner, that's some of the kelp that we're growing in just 1.5 to 2 feet of water. Those blades are actually about 9 to 12 feet in length.
So explain why that's so extraordinary.
Well, just looking at the photo, I would think most people would think it's an extraordinary plant just to look at it. What really is unique about this is it's the first time that I'm aware of that we demonstrated for the first time that kelp can be grown in shallow water. Until we actually grew this on the farm, it was widely held that you could not grow this crop in shallow water because of the length of those blades, that they would deteriorate as they touched the bottom. They would sort of erode just by basic friction of chafing across the bottom. But we just sort of marched ahead and said, well, let's try it and see if it can be done. And it actually, I think in the first test year, where they tested maybe 4 farms, 3 were in deep water, which are traditional. That's traditionally where kelp is grown in 20, 30 feet of water. And this is just, again, 1.5 feet. We actually outperformed the other farms significantly during the majority of the growth season. So it was a great surprise and a lot of excitement surrounding it. Growing kelp provides all the same virtues as growing oysters. It mitigates nitrogen and phosphorus. These are nutrients that potentially lead to harmful algae blooms. The other benefit of growing kelp environmentally is that it's a photosynthesizer. So it's taking up carbon dioxide from the water and it's releasing it as oxygen. So in a way, it's a climate warrior as well.
That's great.
And
it makes delicious dashi.
Yeah, I can tell you, eating this raw kelp, I haven't tasted anything like it. It truly is, it's delicious. Just the texture and the taste, it's rich, it's crunchy. It's good cooked as well, but not like the raw. The raw is just amazing. And so from a practical point of view, from a farmer point of view, it's it's just a blessing to have this crop available to grow. It's minimal equipment requirements, minimal capital investment. It's sort of like a self-cleaning oven. The kelp, unlike oysters, it doesn't need to be tended to. You basically string out 100-foot line, a foot off the bottom, in on my farm's case. The kelp is spooled out onto the line, and that's basically it. You just leave it. It grows. It's one of the fastest growing organisms in the world. We put that kelp out at about 1 millimeter. It's about 1 millimeter in length in December, late December. And by the time April arrives, it's 9 to 12 feet. So it's explosive.
We had a question in the Q&A. Someone was wondering, where do you sell it? What do you do with it?
We don't sell it. Part of the research, besides learning about growing it, has been market research. So for the past 2 years, we've been trying to get it into the hands of as many potential users as possible and get feedback. It's all been positive, from cooks, people that want to use it for fertilizers, plastics, biofuels, cosmetics. I've had soap people I've given it to, soap manufacturers. Right now, I actually was on a kelp webinar last night, 2 nights ago, and we just found out for the first time that individuals can apply for permits to grow the kelp. And once you have that permit from the state and the Army Corps, you can sell it. So luckily, Brookhaven had the foresight when they drew up our leases. In the leases, we're allowed to grow marine plants. So that's one checkbox that's already marked. And now after 2 nights ago, finding out this information, we're moving forward as quickly as possible to get the permit. And we have probably, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 pounds of kelp will come to me in April this year. Maybe we'll be in time to actually sell it this year. If not, for certain next year.
Mm-hmm. That's great. It's exciting.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Right. Yeah. So, there's several questions here I see in the Q&A that I want to direct. And I think this one is from Diana Gordon. She's asking if the local waters are warmer these days, and how does water temperature affect your farming decisions? And so I think I want to point the first part of this question to Steve, and then ask Ben, you and Paul to chime in about how or whether that's affecting your farming. So Steve, are the local waters warmer these days?
Yes, and yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a graph that I could share with you right now, but I mean, the water temperatures in the waters in the ocean in the last 30 years have warmed up by something like 5 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that, which is pretty amazing. And in the bays, the water temperature are reaching levels that we've never seen before. I mean, globally, the warmest temperatures on record happened in 2020, and the last 6 years have been the warmest temperatures on record globally. And that's also happening in the waters as well. So, we were doing some work this year to look at disease progression in Flanders Bay in the Western Peconics. And we saw water temperatures that were, this was like 7-8 feet deep that were 88 degrees, something like that.
Oh,
and so it's really, especially for scallops, I mean, that's really pushing the red line for what they can tolerate. So yes, the waters are warming dramatically. I use this anecdotal story here, but when I first started diving in Long Island waters 30-something years ago, we would wear a 7 mil wetsuit all through the summer, and now we switch over to a 3 mil wetsuit for about a month. And even that can get warm. So that's just kind of a personal observation about how much the water has changed.
Yeah,
so Ben, are you putting a lighter wetsuits on your oysters?
One of the good things about being in deep water and having a crane is that I don't go in the water. So, but oysters are very sensitive to temperature. Temperature tells the oysters what time of the year it is and actually what they should be doing next. So when the temperature is cold, like right now, oysters go into a hibernation state. That means that they lock themselves in and they actually slow down the metabolism and they live through winter based on the energy they have accumulated to the summer. As warm water started getting warmer and you get into the 70 degrees, 50 to 70 degrees, they actually realize, well, it's actually summertime. There's algae in the water. They start eating, and that's why they start actually filtering the water. And as temperatures get a little bit warmer, and actually once you get to like the high 70s, the 80 degrees, it's actually spawning time. It's like party time. So that's actually when the oysters start actually reproducing. So when you see oyster farms that are in the south area of the United States, where warm water are warmer most of the year, oysters are always in the growth mode. That's why you see the southern oysters are much bigger because they're actually growing. Here in the Northeast, we go through the entire cycle. And as the water temperature changes, of course, the cycle actually changes for some of the oysters. 2019 and 2020 have been very unusual years, especially 2020. The summer was a little bit warmer than usual. Waters in our farm were also warmer than usual. And we saw that because some of the babies that we put in the beginning of the year in the water were already market sized by September, which is very unusual. The process that takes 20 months this year, they actually took about 12, 15 months, which is very unusual. We were happy, we were dancing around the boat when we saw that happening, but it's not the norm. It's not the norm.
Yeah,
And
one
oysters are,
to say is, you know, we focus mostly on the maximum temperatures that you see in the summer, but as Ben was talking about in the winter, you know, that's normally a time when the shellfish are basically hibernating. Their metabolism drops very low usually, but with these warmer winters that we've been having, one of the concerns we have with scallops anyway is that, you know, they may be expending a lot more energy over the winter because the temperature is warmer. And we think, although we haven't worked up the data yet, that may be affecting their survival over the course of the year once so, you know, it's
because they're not getting the downtime?
Yeah, they're not getting the downtime. You know, I mean, it's sort of like, you know, you look outside at you know, around the house and around the neighborhood, and you see, you know, plants that are growing in the middle of the winter, and that's not what they're used to. So it's a whole new world for a lot of these organisms, and some of them can adapt to it well, and others not so much.
Steve, we've had a couple of questions around the topic of what the heck happened with the scallops the last 2 years. Can you bring us up to date on what you know?
Yeah. So the mortality of scallops in 2019 it was primarily of adult scallops, and we saw about a 95% mortality of adult scallops in 2019. In 2020, we think it was even higher than that. And the fishery has really been decimated as a result of that. So the causes of it, we believe, are linked to the climate crisis. You know, higher water temperatures, in conjunction, as water temperature warms, the oxygen levels drop naturally. That's a physical property of seawater. So we think that's linked in there. In addition, there's also this disease that's present in 100% of scallops. And the experiments we did this year with Dr. Bassam Alam at Stony Brook, we saw that scallop survival in Orient Harbor, which was cooler, was better than it was in Flanders Bay. So definitely the higher water temperatures are exacerbating the stresses related to the disease. And we think it's also tied in with spawning of the scallops. So in other words, the spawning of scallops, that's a physiologically stressful event for scallops. But when you combine that with high water temperature and the disease, we think that's a real bad situation. And then there's also the possibility that a species of fish which has shown up in big numbers in the last 2 years compared to prior to that, as far as we know, a species called a cow-nosed ray. It is well known for eating adult shellfish, and they are here because the water is warmer. They're primarily a species that you would find down in Chesapeake Bay or the Carolinas or the Gulf of Mexico, but now they're showing up in big numbers, and there are suggestions that they may be contributing to this mortality in not an insignificant way. So we're planning a whole bunch of work this year to look at these different factors to try to get a better understanding of how they're affecting the scallop populations. I mentioned the restoration. Up through 2018, the restoration efforts have been very, very successful, and the scallop fishery and the economic benefits from it have been phenomenal. And then it just crashed in the last 2 years. So we're trying to figure out what's the cause of it, and what can we do going forward.
I've actually heard anecdotally that some of the baymen who've been working scallops are moving into oysters. I don't know if Paul, have you witnessed any of that, or
they're looking to move into our oyster bags.
Into your oyster bags?
Because,
that doesn't sound good.
Times are scarce in the wintertime. It's lean pickings. So we've seen some baymen from out east come into Moriches Bay, hunting around for razor clams, hard shell clamming. But there's no commercial level scallop population in Moriches Bay, so they're not here for the scallops.
Right. Paul, there were a couple of questions that I wanted to direct at you. One of them was a question about whether you ever have a problem with your oysters freezing in the winter, since you're in such shallow water.
That's a good question.
And then related to that, I guess, is there a difference in taste, or is there something about growing oysters on the surface and growing oysters on the bottom of the bay? Are there differences in taste? You want to?
Yeah, the freezing. Steve talked about threats for aquaculture to shellfish farmers, and certainly being on a shallow water farm, our biggest threat are storms and ice. And one of the reasons we located on the north side of the bay is because ice is not so prevalent on the north side of the bay. The prevailing winds in New York in the wintertime are northwest winds, and so the ice freezes on the south side of the bay from waves crashing, and the spray starts to freeze, and then it builds up from the south. That being said, it's still a threat, and so every December we cut all the flotation off of our gear and we sink our bags to the bottom. So our bags are 3.5 inches high, and the average water depths in the wintertime are about 12 to 18 inches. We have a little bit of leeway there to survive. And for the past 6 years, we've had ice maybe 3 of the years. The bags did fine. 1 year the ice froze and it got quite thick. I believe that was in 2018. And it actually got so thick that the ice did grab a percentage of the bags on the farm. I actually watched it from shore. We were out there desperately, for a week, because the bay had been frozen for 10 days, 12 days. We were cracking the ice off the edges of the farm, not only to harvest, but we were hoping to get to the bags that we could see frozen there, the imprints you could see through the ice, to free them. We took a 20-minute lunch break from the work. We came back from lunch, we got down to the beach, and the ice sheet broke off. And in 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, the sheet floated off. The entire farm was ripped out of the bottom and just was flipped 180 degrees like a pancake onto the other side of the farm, which is bad enough. We were able to get that farm back in shape in a week, but about 45 bags were actually just ripped right off the lines and just taken away from the ice. So
ice is a serious hazard.
Yeah, well, what we learned from that year is that our farm is fairly uniform, but when you get to the southern side, of the farm, we have another maybe 6 or 7 inches. So that 6 or 7 inches is a big deal. So now we push all the farm out to the south side of the farm, and we sink the farm in the deepest part of the farm. And so we've been okay since then. The second question was about differences in taste. It's hard to judge. I mean, I wouldn't make I wouldn't generalize about a difference in taste between surface grown oysters and bottom grown oysters. This is something that Ben and the group was talking about this week, and he mentioned before that you know, oysters, like any food, are a product of their environment. So I'm sure that you know, there is a huge variety among oysters, even, you know, grown locally in their taste. Every farm, the oyster is different. Even if the farm is only, I have a farm that's 1,000 feet away from me, and the oysters taste different than my oysters. They're both grown on the surface. And so I think that whatever contributes to flavor in the environment and taste is being picked up by those oysters, and that, and to the extent that it varies among environments, it varies among oysters. So.
Like wine, right?
Huh? Yeah, like wine.
Yeah.
Although you know, it's funny when people ask me, they're looking for this sort of a wine feedback on the oysters, and they say, "Well, what do oysters taste like?" And I say, "Salty," you know. But there's more to it than that, you know.
Yeah. So we have a question about about the water being more acidic now. Steve, this sounds like one for you. The question isn't the water more acidic now as well? And if so, how does that affect the farming?
Yeah, definitely. You know, as the carbon dioxide levels increase in the atmosphere, primarily due to, you know, human input, industry, and burning of fossil fuels, the CO2 levels in the waters also are rising. You know, but you know, when it comes to shellfish living in our waters, which would be considered estuaries. Estuaries are where you have a mix of salt and freshwater, and to varying degrees, of course. You know, the typical situation is that there's really very high fluctuations in pH levels over the course of a tidal cycle. You know, so these shellfish are actually very well adapted to tolerating these fluctuations in pH. You know, so there have been some documented impacts of pH on water. Boy, there was a huge die-off of oysters on the West Coast a few years ago that resulted from water with very different, you know, much more acidic that was introduced into the area where the oysters were being grown. So that had a major impact. But you know,
that was pollution.
I'm sorry.
Was it pollution? Why did it suddenly change?
No, it had to do with the mixing of the water, and that led to a situation where the intake got into water that was you know, very, very adverse to the shellfish, and there was a big die-off. You know, when you have more acidic water, it actually can affect the deposition of shells by these bivalves, and that's particularly acute in the larval stage. So that is a concern. It's been documented in several places, but you know, we haven't seen direct effects of that as far as I know in our work. I don't know about, you know, Ben and Paul, if you've seen that with regard to with your farms, but you know, it's certainly something to be concerned with going forward. But like I say, just the natural fluctuations in pH in the estuary is quite high, and the shellfish are pretty adapted to that at this point. But certainly can get to a point where it's, you know, it's just too much for them.
Have you, Ben, do you or Paul have anything on that?
The point was very important. The impact that acidity has on oysters or shellfish overall is that actually it reduces the amount of calcium carbonate that's in the water, and the shellfish needs that to be able to create shell. So when the industries are affected by acidic oceans or acidic waters, it usually happens in the early stages when the oyster is actually in the larvae stage and they have to set, which in our case, and in our industry in New York, it actually most of the time happens at the hatchery, where it's more of a controlled environment. So we haven't seen that, as Steve mentioned, impacts on that at the farm. And I am actually pleased to hear that, the fluctuations on pH levels will make it more of a stronger animal. So that's good news for us.
Yeah, that was interesting. That was I didn't know that before, but that's welcome news for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't noticed anything. It's very hard to make claims about changes in a 5 or 6 year period. Of course, you can make cursory observations, but when it comes to something so granular like that, I certainly don't have the tools to measure that. I haven't noticed any difference in the health of the oysters or the shells, but I have no doubt that these are, this global phenomenon is going to, at some point, be noticeable.
Yeah, one of the things that's a very good point, Paul, that every year is different. I mean, no matter how long you work at this, it's every year seems to be different than the next one. And one of the things that we've seen with our restoration program is we monitor the spawning of scallops in the natural environment, because that affects how the rotation of the animals in the nets is done, and so forth. And we've seen changes, fluctuations in the timing of spawning, and when we see the most larval settlement to our research or spat collector bags or mesh bags that we put out. And there are what we would consider to be natural fluctuations, but in the last 2 years, we've seen a real change in the spawning patterns of the scallops. Normally, if you looked at a scallop in August, they would be in between the major spawn in the summer or late spring, and then would be gearing up for a fall spawn. But we've seen scallops that were just brimming ripe, ready to burst to spawn in August, which I'd never seen in over 30 years. And that happened in the last 2 years. So, it's just interesting how things can differ from one year to the next so much.
We didn't really tackle this question directly, but we've sort of nibbled around the edges of it, and that is the extent to which wild shellfish are still viable and still ongoing in Long Island waters. We talked a little bit about wild scallops, and it sounds like it's pretty clear that they have to be, that population has to be supported by the feeding program. But what about oysters? Are wild oysters supported by oyster cultivation?
I'll grab that. I mean, theoretically, the existing wild populations, I don't see how they're benefited by oyster cultivation, other than the fact that oyster cultivation, improves water quality. But the great thing about having oyster farms, one of the potentials is that oysters also, the cultivated oysters that we bring into the estuary, also spawn. So there's a potential for them to give rise to natural populations. That's a real upside.
Right. Yeah, potentially that the aquaculture can contribute quite a bit to the local recruitment. As Paul said, probably not so much oysters on Long Island, but certainly in other parts of the world this has happened. But historically, the oyster farms, the big oyster farms on Long Island in the mid 1800s, Frank and Flower and Sons is the only one left, but the Blue Points Company and then also Long Island Oyster Farms, they would get most of their seed from Connecticut, because Connecticut, the juvenile oysters would appear in great numbers around the mouths of the rivers, the Housatonic River, and even the rivers that emptied into New Haven. and they would bring the seed from Connecticut. They would collect the natural seed and bring it to Long Island to grow out. So so even back then, Long Island was dependent upon the seed coming from elsewhere. So it's kind of similar to the aquaculture that's going on now.
As a matter of fact, my site was in the 1800s. Where my farm is situated was actually used to cultivate seed that was brought over from Connecticut.
Oh, cool.
And when the seed reached a certain size, the salinity apparently was different in Moriches Bay prior to the 38 hurricane. And so it was very conducive to growing seed, but the oysters didn't do so well growing from seed to market size. So the seed was then transported over to Great South Bay, where the salinity was higher. And they had a hard time growing seed, but we had a hard time growing market oysters. So it was a good collaboration, I guess, between the two bays. Back then they were called East Bay and West Bay. I mean, East Bay, and they were called West Bay.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
There was another kind of question about some of the history, and that was, someone was wondering, why are the production levels of oysters in New York at such low levels now as compared to previous decades? Is it changes in demand or supply or something else? Does anybody want to, Paul, you?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is the nature of farming has changed in terms of our methods. So I'm sure Steve, maybe Ben, they may know more about this than I do, but my impression is that the oyster farming that was happening back in the 1950s, just to connect with that statistic that you put up, those were being cultivated on bottom by large operations, sort of like Frank Flowers. There was a big operation out in where Ben is, in this right off Shellfisher.
Mm-hmm.
And so they could grow many more oysters with bottom cultivation. You could literally carpet acres and acres with oysters, whereas we're doing off bottom cultivation, and so we can't, the volume of oysters that individual farms can grow is nowhere near what the farms of mid-century, mid 20th century were growing. And similar even to flowers, you can look at that as an example. That one farm produces 150 million oysters a year. You'd be hard pressed to find an oyster farm on Long Island, an off-bottom culture farm that brings 1 million or more oysters to market a year. We have 50 active farms, and very few of those are even at full capacity.
Yeah.
I think there were something like 1,000 farms in the 50s.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's
the industry has reshaped itself, not only because the farms are different, that Paul mentioned, but also the consumers are more educated now. Oysters went from being a commodity, 50s and 60s, you get them out of the water, put them on a can and ship them out. Now people actually want to know what the food comes from. They want to enjoy oyster on a plate. It's actually served, as a whole experience. I can guarantee you that the oysters you'll see today served on a plate is very different than the oyster that was harvested back in the 60s. And that is actually bringing up no puree. Thank God. But it's also bringing a relevance to the industry itself. As we talk about it, that the flavor of the oyster is actually based on the waters where they grow. Well, we have almost 50 oyster farms around multiple places in Long Island. If you are on an island, there's a good chance that you are like 10 miles away from an oyster farm right now. So it's a good chance for people to go explore and taste local oysters and start comparing the flavor profiles. Oysters that are grown in Southold Bay are very different than what actually Paul's growing. It's different what you will see in Mid-Island. And it's a different industry. It's a different market right now.
Boutique market, it's a boutique industry.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple of other things, like in the 1950s, this is when the water quality started to decline dramatically in Great South Bay, and there were a series of algal blooms that started to impact and affect the type of shellfish. I mean, I think prior to that time, the hard clam populations were not that robust, and the oysters were. And then that switched where the hard clams became very abundant. And, into the 1970s and early 1980s, the hard clam harvest out of the Great South Bay was just one of the highest in the world. So the water quality and the type of algae present, some of which were harmful algal blooms, certainly affected that. And then also these oyster diseases that really showed up in huge numbers in effect in the 1950s. In the Chesapeake Bay, and then it also started to make its way into our waters, and so those two things also had a big impact. But also, like the scale of these oyster operations, I think, wasn't it when Blue Point's company was in business that they owned something like 25 square miles in
Great South Bay,
and that was a grant from the King of England, and that's how they were able to own that bottom. And they went out of business, and now the Nature Conservancy has control over those bottoms. But so yeah, the scale, as Ben and Paul have talked about, was much greater back in the day than it is now.
So there's a mussel question here. I don't know if we have if you want to tackle this. It may be, what, I'll ask it, and then you'll tell me if this is too off topic. So the question is, why are the Long Island Sound mussels on the north side of Orient safe to eat, and bay mussels in the creeks are not? And are they safe to eat during open harvest season? Does anybody?
Yeah, I could talk to that. Well, the harvest of shellfish is regulated by the DEC, based on guidelines from the Food and Drug Administration. So the water quality depends on many factors, but shellfishing is only allowed in areas where that water quality is high enough. So much of Long Island Sound, those waters are meet those standards, but some of the creeks and shallower waters in different parts of Long Island don't. So that's why areas may be completely closed to shellfishing even year round in several locations.
And I would expand to that.
Is there mussel aquaculture going on in New York?
Not that I know of. I mean, it's very big in Maine and Canada and Europe, in Rhode Island, or there was. I think there still are in business there, but I'm not aware of it in New York, to be honest with you.
it's not intentional, but they're all over. It's another species that just decided that the farm was its new home, and
Oh yeah.
yeah, that can be a little bit of a problem.
Oh.
Yeah, mussels have this byssal which they use to attach, and they can clump the oysters together within the bag, and it makes it hard for the oysters to cleave and feed. And we haven't really had much mortality, but they make the oysters a little unsightly. You have to kind of pull them apart and sort of scrape off the residue and stuff. So we're not big mussel fans on the farm.
Ben, were you
Not
going
in
to
the
speak to mussels?
No, I was going to expand on what Steve was mentioning about the DEC monitoring the waters, and reinforce to everyone that the oyster industry is actually very safe in New York because of the work that the DEC actually does. It's a very regulated industry. The DEC monitors the water across all of the bays and around Long Island. And based on the quality levels of the water, they decide if actually that shellfish can be harvested there or not. And we are actually monitored by the DEC also on a regular basis to make sure that shellfish is good to eat. Once I harvest my oysters and I send it to a restaurant, I have to put a tag on that states the date, the time, and the location when the oyster was harvested. That tag goes from my farm all the way to the dealer or the distributor in the island, all the way up to the restaurant in the city. And the chef is required to keep that tag attached to that bag until they sell all of the oysters in the restaurant. And now when they are finished with my oysters, they actually are required to keep that tag on their files for 90 days. Wow. So anyone that comes and sits in a restaurant and eats an oyster can ask, where is the oyster coming from? And actually request to see the tags. and they actually just show you where the tax from. There is no way someone can actually get sick from an oyster that actually is not good, and then we know where actually oyster come from. It's actually an extremely regulated industry. It's very safe to eat. That's
Thank
why
you.
if you the question about wild oysters or wild mussels, just make sure the water is regulated. That's what I was going. Make sure the water is regulated and clean before you actually eat them.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, let's see. This is a question for Ben. This is from a neighbor in Raritan Shores. They love to watch you guys work in the water. Years ago, I heard that a private clam company was harvesting toxic clams in Raritan Bay off Staten Island and placing them in Southold Bay to purge them. Was this true? Do you know anything about this?
Yes.
Clams?
I don't know anything. You know anything, Paul? Go ahead.
Yeah. Before I was an oyster farmer, I was a bayman for years, and back in the 90s, there was, and it probably extended actually into the early 2000s. There was a transplant program where clammers would dig oysters in Raritan Bay in uncertified waters, so they weren't safe to eat, and then they would transport them out to the Peconics to a certain area where they would be depurated naturally, and that means they would be put into certified waters, and then the clams, I believe it was 21 days, they would purge themselves of any of the toxins or anything that wasn't safe to consume, and then they would be sold to market. So and those transplant programs still happen today. They're not transported out to that program anymore in the Peconics. It doesn't exist anymore. But that is an important part of the shellfish industry. It is big industry in New Jersey and Barnegat Bay and Raritan Bay, where there's still programs where they're doing depuration now with ultraviolet light onshore.
So basically, these are it's a type of farm.
No, this is all wild harvest. All wild harvest. So the clamor, teams of clammers are going out. They're part of a program. Let's say a team of 10 clammers. They'll go out and dig the clams. Then they transport the clams to a processing facility or a depuration plant.
Okay, so it's a processing plant. It's not a farm.
Yeah.
Huh. Does that work?
Sure. Yeah. As a matter of fact, there was another depuration plant that was constructed on the island in Seaford in the 1990s. That had great potential, but the bottom fell out and it never happened. But yeah, depuration works for sure. Yeah.
All right. This is another question about scallops for Steve. Is anything being done to try to grow scallops in waters farther north? And are the Nantucket scallops experiencing any die-off?
Good question. A colleague, friend was actually doing some work on Nantucket in September of 2020, and we asked them to collect some scallops to bring back to look for this disease organism that Dr. Alam found, and they were 100% infected. So there doesn't seem to be any effect of that up there on Nantucket. It's considerably cooler than it is here. So this, we don't have any baseline data prior to last year or 2019 about this disease. So it may have been here all along, and we just don't know. But like I say, at high water temperatures, this is where we've definitely seen a higher level of mortality play out. So, yeah, there is interest in scallop. Well, they're doing restoration on Nantucket as well as other parts of Massachusetts historically, but scallops are being grown in Maine, and actually bay scallops are being grown in Canada as well. It doesn't seem that there's natural populations that have become well established up there. It's just probably too cold for most of the time. But yeah, they're growing them up there. So yeah, one of the things that we're looking at as a possible way to address the mortality that's occurred is trying to develop strains of scallops that are resistant to temperature and disease to a greater degree. So we're hoping to be able to do some work on that, going forward.
So that would make them hardier for our waters.
Yeah.
Has striped bass had any pressure, put any pressure on shellfish, oysters, or scallops?
I don't think so. I mean, striped bass will eat many things, but I have not been told by anyone that catches striped bass that they've ever seen a scallop in the gut. I mean, they'll eat other fish. They'll eat lobsters, baby lobsters, crabs, but I've never heard anything about scallops.
They're under pressure now too, right? Striped bass.
Well, I guess. I mean, the recreational fishery is very intense on striped bass, and so the regulations, I don't know. It seems they change every year, honestly, the regulations for striped bass. But I know that in some years there's also been a disease outbreak in the population, which has affected the status of the stock.
Right. Then there's a question here about the nacre-based face cream that you all manufacture. Tell us about that.
I was waiting for that question. So we actually, we are big fans of oysters, and we were exploring what other elements can actually highlight the benefits of oysters outside of just eating them, because they are great to eat. So as they're built at shells, if you guys see the inside of a shell is different than the outside of a shell. The inside of a shell is very smooth, and that substance that they create to make it smooth is called oyster nacre. It's the same thing that they use to build their pearls in that case. So oyster nacre is very rich in amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Once we use ingredients that actually are derived from the amino acid, this is actually our face cream. And what it does is actually it's an extract from oyster nacre. Once you apply it to your skin, it creates like a protection blanket and actually makes the skin looks younger and eliminate also any marks that you can have for actually sun or anything like that. So we deployed this at the end of the summer. We worked hard through the pandemic to actually have something different to do in the farm. And actually, we are very happy to have Southold-based skincare featuring our oyster technology face cream. And we might have some more products to come in the future.
That's great. Very interesting. All right. Kelp face cream. Yipes. We got all kinds of stuff going on
Oysters
here.
are fantastic.
Yeah. All right. So we have a lobster question here. Are people raising lobster? Is that aquaculture? Lobster numbers increased since the massive die-off. How are lobsters doing? They're not, right?
I've heard that the populations may be a little better than they were after the big die-off. I don't have any statistics I can share, but that was another case where the researchers concluded that it was because the water was too warm for them, and so there was that big die-off. There has been attempts at culturing lobsters, but didn't go so well. You basically have to keep each individual lobster by itself all the way from the time it's born up to when it's market size, because they eat each other, and it just the logistics of growing lobsters to market size, it just never worked.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, I feel like we've done a good job here. We've covered the waterfront.
From kelp to nacre, we've soup to nuts. Covered it all.
That's right. That's right. And you guys are terrific. Your depth of knowledge is amazing and deeper than your farms in some case.
Yeah, I want to also thank everybody for being on the panel because you all did a great job. It was really fascinating to learn everything from each perspective. So thank you so much for being a part of it. And of course, Charity for doing such a great job fielding questions and creating the conversation for us. It was really great. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Fun.
Thanks for putting this
Yep.
together. And
Yeah.
I
yeah,
see
thanks
there's
for
a
having
you.
us.
I see there are some questions left over, and
Oh, there are?
I don't know. I mean, I'm seeing on mine QA23, but I was just saying if anybody wanted to reach out, they had a question, they could, write to me, paul@greatgunshellfish.com.
Yeah, we'll be putting a recording of this on our website, and we can actually include contact information if you'd like to share
Yeah.
it. So,
Sure.
you can always email me afterwards, and then we'll take care of that. It'll be up on our blog on our website. Okay. So, and also we record it for Facebook, so it'll be available. You'll be able to check it out in numerous places. But thank you again for being
Great.
and spending your evening, and of course for our audience. We had everyone hang on there for the whole duration, which is fantastic. So thank
And
you.
really interesting questions. Terrific
Yeah,
questions.
great questions.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at
Very
this
well informed audience.
Yeah, so we'll be in touch with more programming as we formulate them throughout the season. We have something coming up in February on the living shoreline, the work that we're doing to create a living shoreline in a few of our waterfront properties that the Land Trust is involved with. So that's on February 11th. If anyone's interested in checking that out, it's also listed on our website calendar and will be, of course, on the blog as well. And a program in March on native plants and their importance in the landscape and creating a diverse environment for the wildlife. So, but every month we'll have something new, so tune in. And with that, I think I'm going to say goodnight.
Thanks.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Good night.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
all.
Thank
Appreciate
you
it.
all.
Bye-bye.